Hello, bookish enthusiasts, and get ready to be transported to different worlds, one page at a time. Today, we unlock the doors to The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint Exupéry. Liking this video lets me know that I'm on the right track, and subscribing following my channel ensures you won't miss any future content. And hey, if you're feeling chatty, drop a comment below and let's start a conversation. Chapter I. The story begins when the author is 6 years old. He draws a picture of a boa constrictor who has just swallowed an elephant. He shows his drawing to a group of adults, all of whom believe it to be a drawing of a hat. The author then draws a second picture of a boa constrictor who has eaten an elephant. This time, he shows the elephant clearly inside the boa constrictor. When he shows his second drawing to the adults, they tell him to stop drawing and focus on important subjects like reading, writing, and arithmetic. Thus, the author's career as an artist both begins and ends. Chapter I begins when the author, now a pilot, has an accident that lands him in the middle of the Sahara Desert. He begins to work on his plane in hope of fixing the engine before his supply of water runs out. He sleeps on the desert sand that night, and when he awakens, he hears a voice saying, "If you please, draw me a sheep." The pilot tells the prince that he cannot draw, but the little prince says that doesn't matter. So the pilot shows the prince something he has drawn before, the boa constrictor from the outside, with the elephant not showing except as a bulge. The prince immediately recognizes it for exactly what it is, and the pilot is encouraged. He then draws his best sheep and gives it to the little prince. But the little prince says it won't do. After a series of attempts, the pilot finally draws a box with breathing holes in it and tells the prince that the sheep is inside the box. This satisfies the little prince. The pilot attempts to find out more about the little prince. He asks questions, but the boy does not answer most of them. He is clearly much more interested in his sheep and his own thoughts than in answering questions about himself. When the little prince mentions how nice it is that his sheep has a box to use for a house at night, the pilot offers to draw a rope for the prince to use to tie up the sheep. The prince is perplexed at this, having no idea why anybody would want to tie up a sheep. After a short discussion on the subject, the little prince informs the pilot there will be no need to tie up the sheep because there is no place for the sheep to wander off to. Where he lives, everything is very small. Chapter I. The pilot discusses some of the differences in the way adults and children behave. He goes on to explain a bit more about the book he is writing and why he chose to write it. His purpose in writing the book is as much, he says, to remember the little prince as to write a book. He says to remember the little prince as to write a book. He talks about having been discouraged from drawing when he was a child and reminds us that children understand what is important much better than adults do. He expresses his concern that he might be in danger of becoming too much like a grown-up. So he makes a decision. In spite of his earlier choice to forego drawing and painting, he is now committed to drawing the artwork for this book. Chapter V. This chapter provides the reader with some detail of life on the small planet inhabited by the little prince. It seems that the sheep he is so keen on acquiring is meant to eat little baobab bushes. Baobabs, apparently, if left unattended, grow so large that they threaten to take over the little prince's entire planet. Therefore, the prince spends a great deal of time removing the small baobab bushes as soon as he finds them. It is a matter of discipline. As the little prince points out, when you finished your own toilet in the morning, then it is time to attend to the toilet of your planet. Just so, with the greatest care. The little prince tells the pilot of a lazy man who failed to curb his baobabs and the disastrous consequences of that failure. He then asks the pilot to make a drawing of a planet so overcome by baobabs that it is uninhabitable. He wishes the pilot's drawing to be a lesson to all who follow. The pilot complies. Chapter 5. The pilot discovers the prince's love of sunsets. The little prince tells the pilot he can see the sunset as many times a day as he likes because his planet is so small that by merely moving a chair a few feet, he can be on the other side of the small globe. One day, he tells the pilot he saw the sun set 44 times. The prince also confesses he is sad. When the pilot asks why, the little prince does not answer. Chapter 5. The little prince tells the pilot of his beautiful flower, how he first saw her emerge from the ground and thought she might be a strange kind of baobab. He tells the pilot all about her slow and meticulous grooming prior to showing herself and complains of her excessive vanity. He also confesses that his own limitations made it difficult for him to respond to her appropriately. He admits to feeling a little guilty about having left her. He says he was simply too young to know how to love her. Chapter X. This chapter takes the reader back to the preparations made by the little prince just prior to departing his planet to begin his journey. First, he cleans out his volcanoes, which tend to erupt now and again, if not tended to. Then he plucks the baobabs he can see. His final task is watering and covering his flower with the protective glass globe she had earlier insisted upon. But just as he is about to lower the globe over his flower, she speaks. Her words are of love and forgiveness. She does not rebuke him for leaving, but says she understands and she will be fine. Chapter X. The first stop on the prince's journey is a small planet ruled by a king. The king has no subjects. Naturally, when the little prince appears, the king is quite pleased. He explains to the prince all the orders he gives must be obeyed, but he also takes pains to make it known that if his orders are not followed, it is his own fault for issuing poor instructions. When the prince yawns, the king orders him to yawn more. When the prince says he cannot force a yawn, he is ordered to yawn sometimes rather than on command. The king is very good and amiable. Still, he is a grown-up, and as such, he has a grown-up flaw. He must control. Having no one and nothing on his planet over which to rule, he is very eager to persuade the little prince to stay on. He offers the prince a couple of choice posts in his court, but the little prince cannot be persuaded. He asks the king to order his departure, and then the little prince takes his leave. Chapter Exit. In this chapter, the little prince encounters a man so conceited that he can hear only praise. He asks the little prince to praise him, and the little prince complies. But it is a boring way to spend a day, and after a very short visit, the little prince takes his leave. Chapter Exeunt. The third planet the little prince visits is inhabited by a drunk. This tippler drinks to forget the shame of drinking. The little prince finds this absurd and does not spend much time there. Chapter XCII. The little prince meets a businessman obsessed with counting stars. This makes no sense to the prince, who wishes to know what the man does with the stars. When the man admits he simply counts them, the little prince is baffled. He goes on to explain that he too owns things, his flower and his planet. But unlike the businessman, who merely counts his possessions, the little prince actually cares for his. In this way, he tells the businessman his ownership of them has meaning. But what meaning can come from simply counting stars? The businessman has no satisfactory answer to that question. so the little prince moves on. Chapter Exit. In this chapter, the little prince meets the lamplighter. He is an archetypal adult, but instead of taking on the exaggerated qualities associated with success, this man is a simpleton. He has orders to light and extinguish a lamp, and that is all he does. Since he began his job, the tiny planet he inhabits has increased the speed of its orbit such that the poor lamplighter must constantly either light or extinguish his lamp. It's a non-stop job, and the lamplighter is exceedingly tired. While the little prince recognizes the absurdity of his situation, he also feels love for the lamplighter, who fulfills his orders without fail, no matter how tired he might be. Chapter Exit. When the little prince visits his sixth planet, he meets a geographer. The little prince asks the geographer what a geographer does and is treated to a thorough description. Expecting the geographer's expertise to have resulted in some exciting discoveries, the little prince asks him how many rivers and lakes and mountains are on his planet. But the geographer cannot tell him. It seems that while his credentials as a geographer are not in question, a lack of explorers makes it impossible for him to catalog anything. A geographer, he explains to the little prince, cannot be bothered with exploring. That is too mundane a task for one as important as a geographer. So the little prince tells the geographer about life on his own planet and about his flower and his volcanoes. The geographer tells the prince that the flower is not important enough to be documented in his work because a flower is ephemeral. They discuss the meaning of this word, and then the little prince departs for the seventh planet he will visit, planet Earth. Chapter Exit. This chapter consists of the author's assessment of the planet Earth as it pertains to the general breakdown of adult types. He estimates there are over 100 kings, almost 100,000 businessmen, 750,000 tipplers, and well over 300,000 conceited men. Yet the most impressive of them all are the lamplighters, who would perform, prior to the advent of electricity, of course, each day and night like clockwork. Country by country, the lights would go on and then off again, and each day all the lamplighters would carry out their orders in precisely the same manner. He describes their daily ritual as one of great pageantry, using the visual image of a group of soldiers who dance together in perfect order, so that just as one set of lights goes out, another is immediately lit. It is, he says, magnificent. Chapter XV. The little prince takes the advice of the geographer and decides to visit planet Earth. In this chapter, he meets his first earthling, a snake. The snake tells the prince that he normally kills whatever he touches, but that he can tell the prince is innocent and true, and that he comes from a star. For this reason, the snake spares him. But he does tell the prince that if he should decide at some future date to go back from whence he came, he can ask the snake for assistance. The little prince understands quite well. This foreshadows the end of the story, when the prince will return to the snake for the poison that will release him from his earthly body. Chapter XVI. The prince has a short conversation with an unremarkable flower. The flower tells the prince that as far as she knows, there are only about 6 or 7 men in existence, and they are a bit hard to keep track of since they haven't any roots. Chapter VI. Here, the little prince finds himself completely alone in the desert. He thinks that if he climbs the nearest peak, he will be able to survey the entire planet. But this planet is much too big for that. Still, he does try to engage with whomever might be out there in the desert. He does so by saying good morning in a very polite fashion. As he speaks, his voice echoes throughout, giving the impression of people nearby. The little prince says a few more things. hears them echoed several times, and concludes that the people of Earth have no imagination because they merely repeat whatever is said to them. Chapter XX. The little prince finds a rose garden and is surprised to learn that his flower is not unique. Yet at the same time, he realizes that her need to be seen as unique is very strong. So strong, in fact, that should he fail to fulfill caring for her appropriately, she will wither and die. Saddened by the knowledge that his flower is not unique, and a little depressed about the relatively small size of his volcanoes, he decides that both disappointments mean he is not a very great prince. He lies down and cries. Chapter XE. This is one of the longest chapters in this book. It is also one of the most profound. In it, the little prince meets a fox who teaches him the lessons of love. He teaches the little prince that to take responsibility for someone or something creates a bond that lasts forever. One only understands the thing one tems, he tells the prince. Then he asks the little prince to tame him. He wants to form a bond with the prince so that the prince will not be just another human being, but a friend. The little prince hesitates because he hasn't much time to spare, but the fox convinces him to stay a while. Then the fox explains to the prince exactly what taming is all about. They complete the taming process and become friends, but the little prince must leave the fox to continue on his journey. The friendship between the two has grown so much, the fox is very sad to see the prince depart. When the prince is about to leave, the fox tells the prince a secret. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Chapter XI. Here the little prince meets a switchman. The switchman operates the switch that moves the trains from one track to the next. The two converse briefly about how fast trains move, where the passengers are going, and what they're looking for. The switchman tells the prince that the passengers are mostly asleep and aren't really pursuing anything. Only the children have their noses against the glass. Only the children are looking out with curiosity and wonder. Chapter XI. The merchant whom the little prince encounters in this chapter is selling pills to quench thirst. He promotes them by saying that they save time. 1 pill per week replaces 53 minutes that would otherwise be spent finding and consuming water. When the little prince asks what one should do with this saved time, the merchant doesn't have a set answer. Instead, he tells the prince he may do whatever he likes with the time. The little prince responds by saying that he would spend his extra time taking a leisurely walk toward a freshwater spring. Chapter Exit. The pilot has been listening to the prince tell of his meetings with the various characters he has encountered. When the story of the merchant ends, the pilot is drinking the last of his water supply. He has not repaired his engine, and he is beginning to worry about his fate. The little prince says he is also thirsty and reminds the pilot of the wisdom imparted to him by his friend, the fox. He tells the pilot that the beauty of the desert inn is the well that cannot be seen, and so the two of them begin to walk in search of the well. The following morning, they find one. Chapter XX. The prince and the pilot find a well, just like the kind one might find in a village. There is a bucket and a pulley, and everything looks like it was waiting for them to arrive. They drink from the well, and the pilot asks the little prince some questions. The prince doesn't answer directly, but he flushes quite often, leading the pilot to believe the things he is suggesting to the prince are true. In the end, the pilot feels sad again. He seems to know the prince is planning to return home. Chapter XV. Chapter XV. The pilot is home. It has been 6 years since his meeting with the little prince. He tells how well received he was upon his return home and how pleased everybody was to see him. He talks about the little prince and what he learned from him. He understands now. How important it is to be able to look up at the stars and ask the question, did the sheep eat the flower? Yes or no?